Greetings, my fellow connectors. Welcome to the Musical Connections podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube, welcome aboard. And if you're listening to this on your favorite streaming services, whether it's through the RSS feed or the Apple podcast, welcome back. Well, I've been waiting to get this guy on my show for a very long time. You can call his music synth-wave, it could be video game music, but it is heavily inspired by 80s synthesizers and rock and roll, and from movies like Tron and Terminator. My guest today here on Musical Connections, coming down Connector's Corner, is Dean Parsons. You may know him simply as Arcade Knights. Welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks so much, Zach. Really appreciate you having me on the show and all the things you're doing for the local music community, man. Rock on. It's great stuff.
I really appreciate it, Dean. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you so much for your continued support of the show. It really means the world.
Awesome.
Now, of course, you got this project called Arcade Knights, and you call this like a synthwave, like high energy project, really influenced by movies like Tron, and even like when Daft Punk did the Tron movies too. Like I think you're taking some inspiration from that as well, but we'll get more into that later. Tell me first about how you came up with this project, Arcade Knights.
I think for me, being an 80s kid, there was a time when, growing up in the 80s, I was somewhat parented in some ways by 80s films. And for me, being an 80s kid at this day and age, kind of going back and reminiscing and being nostalgic about what partially made me me, wanted me to kind of contribute more to that. And really music, I've always loved the score music for movies and stuff like that. So 2 years ago, I said, well, I'm going to give my hand at maybe making some music like this. And so I legit binged watch all of my iconic favorite 80s films and started like the idea of how do I feel by watching those? How do I translate that feeling and concept into music? And that's how I got started 2 years ago.
That's amazing. And I did mention some of the movies off the top here. I said Tron. I think you're really heavily being influenced by Tron, especially like the Tron Legacy stuff as well.
Yep.
You also have the Terminator. I will be back and get you the job.
Awesome.
Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you're watching this, please hire me. But
so fantastic. So Tron for sure, Terminator for sure, like Lost Boys, Escape from New York, Halloween, like all of those iconic 80s films, Rambo, that were in the kind of action genre, but also the kind of sci-fi and even some of the horror stuff. And watching those as I was kind of growing up kind of gave me this feeling, this idea. And even like Rambo, to be cheesy, kind of gave me a heroic kind of feel when I was young watching this. And the scores were a major part of that. And so, yeah, influenced heavily by 80s movies, scores, and the time of the 80s. So Miami Vice, as an example, as a television show, the neon kind of nostalgia from that as well, all of that stuff.
And let's actually get into that new record, Neon Vice. You put that out on September 12th, and you also put out a single, which we played here on Newfoundland Releases about a week or two ago, called Red Line Rival. Tell me a little bit about the making of this record. And of course, you took a lot of this from the Miami Vice era. 80s rock anthems, neon lights, fast cars, and undercover cops. Like very, action-packed kind of stuff that you would definitely see in the 80s. What was it like making this record?
So absolutely right. Inspired by that whole era of Miami Vice, kind of danger in the streets, kind of fighting the bad guys, that kind of stuff. And so for me, every album that I write, there's a concept and idea for an album, not just a track. And so when I wanted to write this, I thought of the idea of like being involved in kind of fighting crime back in the 80s and how that would unfold as a cop or how that would unfold as a detective and so on. And so I kind of have my own spin on it. So the album really started with the idea, and then I started writing each track sequentially to tell the story of how this would unfold. And so usually the idea of the album comes first, and then after that, it's how do I feel this part of the album or this part of the story? And based on that, I select 80s kind of nostalgic chords, which whole other chord progressions used in the 80s, kind of romantic, warm, kind of gritty feel in some ways. So I select the chord progression, I select the key that it's in and the mode to give a feeling, whether it's fast-paced car kind of chases or whether it's there was a loss, someone was killed, there's some kind of a loss, and how to explain that through music. So I'm really particular on how I create the tracks and when I use the signatures and when I use the modes and the keys.
Oh, for sure. Now, that was actually going to be my next question, your songwriting process, because you do take a lot from the 1980s, and the 80s
Yeah,
were dominant in synth pop. I mean, you look at bands like
yeah,
Devo, Duran Duran, you got Depeche
100%.
Mode, yeah, the Eurythmics, all these great 80s synth pop classics that would really fit in today's music, if you ask me. Going a little bit more into what your songwriting process is like, and do you have like any like people singing on these tracks, or is it just instrumental?
Yeah, so in this album, Neon Vice, it's really kind of the score, I guess, of a movie. And there is one track which is called Neon Vice, the narrative version or narrative kickoff of the track or kickoff of the album. So I do have a person talking about what the album is, and it's kind of from the perspective of that cop in the 80s fighting crime. So there's this an element of drive. So there is that track that has lyrics. But when I go back to the instruments that I use, how I create the music, I'll be honest with you, Zach. 2 years ago, when I started this, I tried the common way of using a DAW, digital audio workstation, and all of my music is electronic, meaning I create it all in a hardware system. I don't use a DAW. I tried the DAW process, I failed at it, and I didn't feel that my emotions actually came through the mouse clicks or, into the computer properly. And so for me, I legit took the laptop that I had my DAW on, that I paid for. I closed the lid, put it aside. It's like, I'm done. Can't write music. This doesn't make sense to me. And then 2 days later, I'm like, no, there's got to be another way. And then I found hardware groove boxes. I found the DX7 Yamaha synthesizers. So I went back to the authentic hardware used in the 80s with the authentic library sounds and samples and the tones created from those earlier synths. So now I only create on a hardware because it allows me to have that tactile feel. So I'm hitting the pads, I'm turning the knobs, and I'm creating that way. And I think that how I create comes through in the hardware and as I use the keys, use the pads, use the knobs. So that's a large part of what I do. So it's all in hardware, mixed and mastered even in hardware, and it never touches a computer system until it is uploaded to a streaming platform or uploaded to my site where it's all downloadable for in wave form for with bonus content and stuff like that. So yeah, for me, going back and finding the idea of the hardware and using the hardware, it's the authentic 80s synth sounds from Miami Vice, from Terminator. Like I use as I mentioned, the Yamaha DX7, the Oppenheim OB8, for example, the Lynn drums from the 80s, Simmons drums from the 80s. So it captures that full vibe of the 80s because I'm using the authentic sounds. I'm not emulating it. So, and yeah, hardware, love the hardware aspect. I don't know if I would be creating any music if I didn't find that those hardware elements and authentic hardware, which I'll putting it all into one main system that I have, which is basically an Akai MPC. So it puts it all into one hardware component, and that's how I do it.
That's interesting because a lot of people wouldn't really use the hardware to make digitally sounding kind of synthesizer music that would really fit in today's modern music, because a lot of people would use digital software like DAWs and MIDIs, even AI nowadays. But for you to use the hardware, like that's really interesting because barely anybody would really like use hardware to make music anymore, and like use those kind of like analog kind of what's the word I'm looking for here? Geez, why
It's
is it
the
not
kind
coming to
of
me?
grit. It's the grit. It's the hardware, and it's the so I agree that it's the common way to go through a DAW. And to each their own. There's nothing wrong with the DAW, but for me, the tactile piece, and I will say that there is some slight differences for sure in an emulated sound from the 80s and what you'd get from the actual hardware. But for me, it's not just, oh, I want authentic 80s sounds, go directly to hardware. It's that piece, but it's also I have the keys, I have the pads, I have the knobs I can turn and change the oscillation and all that stuff. So it might not be common, but it's the way that it makes me feel like I'm communicating the best representation of how I'm feeling.
I just found the word mixing console, like analog mixing consoles, because you have
Yeah,
those
yeah, for
eight
sure.
tracks, your 32 tracks, but now everything's like very digitized and stuff.
Yeah.
So it's very cool that you are probably one of the very rare people here in the province that would go through hardware to make some technologically advanced music like you do.
Cool. Yeah, it's awesome. I think it kind of, I guess, unintentionally makes it unique, but I do feel there's a grit that kind of comes through, and there's a raw, but there's also like a romantic feel for some of these from some of these sounds. And I think it comes back to not just using the sounds. There's there's 80s chord progressions that I learned to get the right kind of feel. And they're not just your typical triad or something. Like there's augmented chords, there's seventh, there's ninth chords. All of those things really come into play. So for writing this album for me was a challenge as I've been learning how to do this properly and learning how to communicate properly. So I didn't cut any corners. I spent the time really focusing on how do I make this feel authentic and back to the album, which part of the album or story am I in? And so that all plays a huge role.
That's wonderful. Now, of course, when you were talking about, your songwriting process and how, make this music, and you make it all through hardware, and then once you get it ready, you then upload it to your streaming services, respectively, into your website. You were talking about bonus content as well. Now, when I was doing research for this conversation, I heard that you made a comic book for one of your albums. Tell me about that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And so, and again, unintentionally, as I've been writing and have the idea in my head, I'll write it down. I'll kind of document what I'm thinking, where I want to go with the story. And so what I found was I've actually released two now, and I have a third graphic novel coming up.
Awesome.
Is that the story? Yeah, thanks. It like the story wasn't done for me, so I cap off the album like 10, 11 tracks, and that's when the story's done musically. And then what I found is that I still have more content to share, more backstory on the characters, more backstory on the storyline and what happens next. And so that story was still in my head, and I just started expanding it on paper. And what happened was I had enough for a graphic novel that told the story. So with my debut album, Justice, which is also kind of an 80s kind of theme, kind of adventure, that has a comic book visually that kind of shows you how the character evolves through the story. I've also written one and released one on my fairly recent album, before Neon Vice, the older album called Cyberhack. That's a full, larger graphic novel on a cyberhack event and an evil kind of AI, which we can all identify with today, and retro hackers fighting an evil AI. So I released both of those graphic novels on Amazon. Also on my site, they're downloadable. That's the bonus content, which is downloadable in PDF and so on and so forth. And the new one that I have coming up, I guess, in October is the year anniversary of my Stranger Things inspired album called Dark Fate. And that has its own accompanied graphic novel coming out as well on Stranger Things Day, November 6th. So yeah, I guess back to what I create and what I provide, not just to streaming platforms. I think that's a piece of the music industry and maybe not super lucrative, but I think I reach a lot of people that way. But I think that my website and the bonus content, which is the album artwork, the lyrics in many of the tracks, all of that stuff, and there's the PDF downloadable graphic novel, expands the universe that I create. And what's interesting, Zach, is that I've actually had people, fans, families of like 80s parents with their kids, like listening to my tracks and my album, spinning it from start to finish while their kids are kind of reading the graphic novels. And I've gotten
Wow.
pictures from, yeah, it's pretty wild. I've gotten pictures from fans' families, and like they're all kind of like on a Friday night spending some time together listening to music and with a book in their hand, which is my graphic novel, and it kind of they're skipping through it. So unintentionally, I've created this kind of world in many cases where it not only gives you the audio, but it gives you the book and the tactile feel of the art that way. And so we're actually seeing people, or I'm seeing people who get the album and they start the album and they start reading the graphic novel, and they really find that the album is the soundtrack for the graphic novel.
That's incredible, and it's good. It's a good thing too that you're diving into this whole other pool of creativity for yourself, because a lot of people would just release their music and then put it to streaming and then just hope for the best. Now I know that's not the case for everybody, and just from the people that I've been talking to, streaming like is great for exposure, but it doesn't really help you pay the bills. So going down this avenue of creating graphic novels along with putting out your records. It's really great to see that both are working really well for you.
Thanks. It's actually cool because like there's people reviewing it on Amazon because you can get it on Amazon. That's the hard copy. People are reviewing it. They're telling me how they're experiencing it. People are DMing me from Facebook, from YouTube, from Instagram, etc. And they're saying like how they're experiencing it. And again, I'll say it wasn't my intention. It's just like I have something to create. I want to release it. How do I do that? And I selected the downloadables for my website. I selected printed copies, and I did not anticipate this response. But I would agree with you 100%, Zach, that I think streaming is a small part of being a musician today. I think it definitely is expected. I even see musicians steer away from it for, rightful reason from their perspective. But I don't think it should be the only avenue to connect with people at all. I think it's very low return of investment. I think it's somewhat of a necessity, depending on how you're feeling about it. But yeah, so I go beyond just streaming for sure, and live shows and stuff like that as well. So.
So, how did this all start for you, Dean? Because um, I've only really known you now for about a year or so since you started, sending me your songs for the Newfound Releases segment of Musical Connections. Where'd you grow up to, and how did you get into music?
Yeah, so thanks again for spinning up all the content that you do and also mine as well for the Newfound. Love it. It's fantastic. So for me, I actually grew up outside of St. John's. I grew up in the town of Bristol's Hope kind of thing. And for me, kind of being out in the woods, I had a lot of things to kind of focus on. For me, it was getting outside on a regular basis on a skateboard. That's really how I grew up. That was my mode of transportation. That was what I spent a lot of time and effort on, learning tricks and focusing on, I guess, an art or a sport. But in the evenings kind of thing, when it's pouring rain out and I can't go skateboarding all the time, then I really turn to those 80s films. Learned a lot from my interpretation of those 80s films, whether it be Rambo, The Goonies, The Lost Boys, Terminator, those kinds of things. And so back then, I definitely think that helped shape who I am today. And Arcade Nights is a representation of like a callback, but like almost like a kind of a love letter to the 80s and a very positive one at that. My music, I think, in large, is very positive. There's some dark elements for sure, where the chord progressions, the bridges take you on a certain other area, based on the stories that I create. And but in large, sort of a spoiler alert, the last part of every album, there's definitely a kind of a positive, uplifting, you got this kind of, you can be the hero of what you want to do in life kind of message. And on every album, there's that element for sure.
That's wonderful. Now, of course, you take a lot of inspiration from 80s movies. What about
Yeah.
80s musicians? Because I did mention Devo and Duran Duran and all the synth pop legends that came from the 1980s. Anything that stick out in your mind from the 1980s music wise that you really take inspiration from?
For sure. So Duran Duran, for sure, without question. John Carpenter, without a doubt, because John Carpenter not only is a filmmaker, he created like Escape from New York. For example, he created his scores for those record or for those movies as well. So Depeche Mode, for sure. John Carpenter, Human League, Duran Duran, as you mentioned, Tears for Fears. Like I could go on and on. Simple Minds, like all of that. But also there's the rock elements of the 80s as well. So like yeah, I grew up listening to Iron Maiden, I grew up listening to Poison, Platinum Blonde, right? Like all of that stuff. And so I think that what I write and how I write it, there's an element of romance from the 80s, which sounds cheesy and corny, but there's definitely these romantic chord changes. Using the E piano from the DX7, and also there's this element of dark synth, so that the tones that were used on Oberheim's and the really bass heavy synths, I use those as well, and that's inspiration I think from Terminator. So I think it's really every record I create has its own theme. So High Score, that album has like a Tron theme, an arcade game feel to it. And I think that Neon Vice, this recent album, really is that kind of dreamy, nostalgic, warm neon chords, if you will, from the 80s, but there's dark elements in that as well. So going back to your original question, for sure, those are the main kind of inspirations. So even Tangerine Dream. But Jan Hammer as well. So he created the score for Miami Vice and largely Neon Vice. This album is largely inspired by what he used as synthesizers. So like the Fairlight synthesizer, for example. So all of those things I think make up my direction, and I've selected each album I select a direction, and I'm very minimalistic in what I select. For example, when I used the DAW, there was just so many opportunities and so many making processes that had to be done. I think for me, when I get the idea, I limit my sound design to that era, to that story, to that design, and that helps me focus more, and it also helps me stay within the path of what I'm talking about and what I want to create. And therein lies, I think, part of what makes me maybe unique in some cases, and I think unintentionally, is that this concept I write about or the storyline it's in that same overall album universe. And so you won't hear like a pops kind of track and then you won't then be followed by like a deep Terminator kind of inspired dark synth. There's the albums have this own their own kind of area of the 80s, and that's how I kind of create, yeah.
That's awesome. Now, of course, I keep going back to video games for some reason for me because my knowledge of '80s movies is very limited because, of course, I wasn't born in the '80s. I was born in the late '90s. But I just go back to that because I think of like games like Cyberpunk 2077 or even like
Yeah.
some of the JRPGs that come out. Like I don't know if Shin Megami Tensei is one that uses synthesizers from the '80s. Help create the scores for those games. But I keep going
Yeah.
back to that because like these are like some songs that you would definitely hear in video games
Yeah.
today because they really take a lot of inspiration from the 80s.
For sure. So what's interesting about that comment is that a lot of the synths I mentioned are actually used on late 80s kind of games and into the early 90s. So like the games for like Zelda, for example, on Game Boy, on Nintendo and Super NES and all that kind of stuff, they used a lot of similar synths. Now, what's also interesting about that is that I actually am writing new material. And so the new material is heavily 100% focused on game music only. So
Wow.
much so, yep. So much so that I actually have a number of Game Boys. So like legit, like you remember the Game Boy like handhelds.
Oh
So I have
yeah.
a number of those. Yeah, yeah, awesome. So I have a number of those, and I'm actually using that. I'm hacking the hardware of that so I can use those as actual synthesizers. There's something called a SID chip inside of them, and I'm using that chip to extract out and use not the sounds from the game, but the actual onboard synthesizer chip inside the Game Boy to create my sounds for my next album, which is 100% chip tune, which is game inspired music. So it's not arcade, there's not like flush kind of warm pads. It's the gritty kind of pop sound of, I guess, yeah, like games from the 80s and into the 90s. And so I'm using them already. I've created some tracks already, and I'm not sure when that album's going to be released, but there's a story in that album of like this unintended kind of hero working through worlds and working through bosses and working to, kind of save the day. But yeah, so that's coming up. And you might ask, well, what do you mean by hacking hardware? So in my day job, because currently I still have a day job, it is I'm basically an ethical hacker. So I protect power grids, manufacturing facilities, and so I'm in these engineering environments quite a bit. So what I mean by that is I have to understand how these systems are compromised and hacked in today's day and age so I can protect them. So when I say the words hacking hardware, I'm legit connecting the Game Boy on its circuit board to my hardware and using the synths and then creating the sound and then recording the sound in my hardware. If that makes any sense.
An ethical hacker. I never even heard of that.
Yeah, everyone knows what a hacker is. From my perspective, I feel I'm the good person. I'm the ethical hacker. So hacking systems to understand how they can be compromised so we can protect them. And that's really my day job.
That's incredible. Now,
Also, yeah, also growing up in the 80s, I mean, using dial tone phones and modems to connect with computer systems. So that's early 80s retro hacking right there.
that's incredible, dude. Now, of course, we're gonna play one of those songs from Neon Vice in just a moment. Here, we're gonna play "When Bullets Fly," and that's also from the new record. So, if you have a favorite song off this record, what would that be and why?
It's hard to decide. I think for me, if I can do two tracks, I think the
Go for
ones
it.
and they all fit. Yeah, they all fit. I think that they all fit for sure. And I think taking one out kind of breaks the story a bit, but they're all great to listen to individually. So when the bullets fly for me is like stuff has just gotten real, and you kind of have to kind of protect yourself against the bad guys or whatever. So when bullets fly is punchy. There's this kind of off kind of key signature in some areas that kind of make you feel involved and kind of empowered. So When Bullets Fly for sure was easy to write, rolled off the tongue, if you will, rolled off from the keys. And the other one I think is if I had to pick one other one, and it's so hard, is Into the Neon, where it's kind of using Phil Collins kind of Roland. I think it was a 79 a synth that he used on the kind of drums for In the Air Tonight. It doesn't use the same chord progression at all, but it uses the instrumentation and the instruments in there tonight, which is iconic from the 80s. So When Bullets Fly and then Into the Neon would be my favorites, and it's super hard to select that.
I mean, like when it comes to choosing your favorite songs, like choosing like one of your kids, like okay, you're
Yep,
good,
super
then
hard.
you're better, and then it's just like
I think they
you love
all
them
fit.
all
Yeah, they all fit in sequence, I think, but they can be listened to individually.
for sure. And good thing you mentioned Phil Collins there, because "In the Air Tonight" is definitely one of his most iconic tracks. And then my favorite part, of course, is the drum solo, where he just like he walks over to the stage, and when he does this live, he just walks
Yeah.
around the stage, goes up to his drum set, and goes right to the drum solo, and then just epicness all around.
And what I'll say in that moment when I first seen that, and several times in the 80s growing up, was that it's hands-on equipment, man. It's hardware that he's using, but there's also, of course, the acoustic drums. Like, so it's not a keystroke, right? It's so yeah, I love the passion that you can see coming out through that method of creating.
For sure. Now, of course, do you have any future plans to, like say do an album release show or something like that? And you did tell me you're working on new music, which is inspired by those 80s and 90s video games, and like hacking Game Boys and also hacking cell phones, like the old Samsungs
Yep.
and Nokias and stuff like that.
Yep.
Anything else in the works?
Yeah, so I'm so upcoming. So later next month in October. The idea is to be part of the Avalon Expo, and the idea is I'm going to be doing a show which is all inspired by kind of Halloween, kind of horror, but there's a twist on it. For me, it's from the 80s, so I am actually doing covers of 80s music themes like Halloween, for example. I'm going to be spinning up and performing live my entire Dark Fate album inspired by Stranger Things. So that's coming up. I think it's like near or on Halloween, one or the other. But yeah, that's October. So that's the most recent show that I have coming up. But for sure, my next album, which is really that kind of chip tune 80s kind of and 90s Game Boy sounds, I'm definitely want to have a release party for that as well and a live show, but just not sure when that is.
That's wonderful, brother. We're going to get to When Bullets Fly very, very shortly. But for when people want to find out more about what you got coming up in store and where to get these songs, we're going to go when it comes to, say, a website to go to and social media.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm on the usual platforms. So Instagram, I am Arcade Knights 88. Same with YouTube, Arcade Knights 88. And also on TikTok, it's Arcade Knights. Facebook is Arcade Knights. But I actually I'm on Spotify as well as Arcade Knights. But if you want the additional stuff that we talked about earlier, the kind of the extra content that kind of makes it feel more than just a stream, I actually have a number of websites. One is arcadeknights.gumroad.com. And I actually have a merch site I'm just about to launch, which is arcadeknightsband.com. So on the usual places, and my graphic novels that I'm released already and coming out is on Amazon.ca.
Dean Parsons goes by Arcade Knights. Dean, it's been a pleasure to get you on the podcast finally. And this is episode 139 of the show, of the main series. I've done more bonus episodes aside from this. But thanks for your continued support of the show, and thanks for sending in all the great tunes, too. And thanks for, being so supportive of what I do, man. And keep up the great work that you're doing. And thanks again for doing this.
Thanks so much, Zach.